that place over there? It's like they build a new airport terminal, right?
Boat shed, fish plant, a sphinx, a staple gun.
Simple things are timeless things. People may not like them at the time, but they'll like them in the long run.
He should be internationally renowned. He's one of the best architects in the world from my perspective.
Feels like a glove. It fits completely.
And I think the space between is the most important element of architecture.
Hello, I'm Jim Nunn, and welcome to Land Sea. Today we meet architect Brian MacKay-Lyons. MacKay-Lyons speaks the language of barn and boat. You can see it in his houses, which have become landmarks along the Nova Scotian coast.
Sometimes Brian MacKay-Lyons looks anything but a leading Canadian architect. He's happy at work on his land in Lunenburg County.
I'd like to think about the practice of architecture like being a farmer. That you leave the world a little bit better than the way you found it. So instead of putting a building in the middle of a field and consuming that field, I would put the building on the edge of the field and cultivate the field.
This old Cape Cod house is the family's country home. MacKay-Lyons bought the property in the 1980s. The young architect won the first of 5 Governor General's medals for his courageous, if whimsical, renovation of the old house.
Not everybody puts a lighthouse-like structure on the roof.
Yeah, jury's not in on that yet. You know, after 25 years, it seems a little bit like the folly of a young architect to me now, but the tower bit part of it. So it's a log house, and it had blown downhill this way over 250 years off plumb. And so we tried to straighten it out, but we couldn't quite. And so we had to insulate it. So we put the reason it has thick walls is because we had to build a 2x4 wall on the inside, which was plumb. So we have a square house inside of a crooked house. We found the old hearth and restored it. So that's kind of like the archetypal house, you know, the essential house, you know, the hearth and space around the hearth. So it really is the very meaning of gathering and family.
The structure constructed around the old hearth has 4 levels.
And that's where everybody sleeps inside the house. So there's all kinds of berths inside this chimney, if you like.
The Cape Cod has pride of place in a typical barnyard. All the structures you'd expect are here. Sheds, chicken coops, and of course, barns. The basic principles of his architecture are rooted right here.
This courtyard really is barnyard, is all about respecting the vernacular forms. And so even a new building, like my tractor shed over there, while it's a new building, it's built with completely in a vernacular.
It doesn't look particularly new. It looks as old as this barn. So you've accomplished your purpose there, have you?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're not supposed to be able to tell sometimes. Sometimes it's important to just do good background things.
I can see through it.
A lot of these sheds, both fish sheds and farm sheds that have doors on the gable ends are driving sheds. You drive through them, like I drive through that with my tractor. I see that building in a way as a camera, as a landscape viewing instrument, as much as anything. Half was chickens and the other half...
For this architect, it's all about the courtyard and the spaces between buildings.
Well, it gives you a sense of comfort, I think, especially in an agricultural landscape where things are clear-cut, are open land. Well, see, this face of the barn is exactly in line with that tractor shed.
So it is.
So you get this kind of kitty corner thing.
And this?
This is the chicken house where my wife and I actually live.
I see. What do you like about it?
Well, it's so cozy and so almost primitive in a kind of archetypal way. It's a great place to sleep. You could really sleep in there. And the light and the air and everything goes right through it. So you feel like you're really in the landscape. And you can get this ocean sounds from here. It's great.
And the kids are in the house.
Yeah. Every night there's, 15, 20 people in there having dinner. So if you want to get some privacy, you got to go and sneak off
to the chicken
house. When I tell people that all my ideas come from studying these traditional buildings, and then they see the new architecture, some people have a hard time making that connection.
Across the bay from MacKay-Lyons' land is another of his houses, the Hill House. In fact, it's two houses, one for the owners, the second a combination guest house and barn. The site, the hill where they would build, spoke to MacKay-Lyons of the house that should go there.
It builds on top of the hill, like the farms around the county do. The barns and so on are on top of the hill, which creates a problem because you want to get up on top of the hill to get this amazing view all around, this panoramic view, and then you get up there and the hill causes the wind to speed up and suddenly you need protection. So I would say this house is both about prospect, about getting on top, and then about creating a courtyard house that gives protection, that looks in on itself.
Would it offend you to be told that they look like big boulders?
No, that would be a good thing. You know, they change. People call them all kinds of funny things, I'm sure. But they change depending on the light. So in the morning, from where I live, they look like rock outcrops out of the hill, and they look like the very hill itself. And then in the west, in the afternoon, it gets well lit, and it looks absolutely bold and out there and very visible.
Toon Nattegaal and his wife moved into this house 4 years ago, leaving behind a softer landscape in the Netherlands.
This is, for a European guy, the ultimate dream. Nowhere in Europe, maybe up north in Sweden, where it's dark half of the year, you would find a place like this. I mean, even if you were a multi-billionaire, I mean, it's just not available, a place like this with a view over the ocean. We volunteered one day for the folk art festival in Lunenburg, and I was working there, and there was this American guy, and he said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "In Kingsburg." "Oh, in Kingsburg. Have you seen that place over there? It's like they built a new airport terminal, right?" I said, "That's the place I live." And he looked at me and he said, "Gee." So some people have difficulties with the shape of the house because it's not a usual shape. But I've had reactions also from people who have been raised here, and they think it's wonderful.
While the main house feels spacious, it's not huge. So the architect brought the landscape in. The cabinetry was one device.
The working part of the kitchen, which has the soapstone, and then the butcher block continuation of it inside, and then the wood box outside, and then the concrete wall that shelters the garden, seems to reach out toward the ocean horizon.
Aren't these simple buildings?
Pretty simple. And it's taken me a long time to learn how to make them so simple. And I've used traditional technology to do it. Like by talking to old guys, by talking to old carpenters, learning how to make a woven corner, like you see there, out of 4 layers of 4-inch to the weather shingles and so on. Those are very traditional details. And so you know the good details because they've been around a long time. So this project comes as close as any to that plainness that I like, which I think is a cultural ethic here in Atlantic Canada. In our culture, plainness is almost a kind of virtue, right? It's a Spartan, simple aesthetic. I get that more from looking at the barns and fish sheds than I do from looking at the homes, the traditional homes. I have a lot of trouble with this tarted up, new, fake old architecture.
You're not a fan?
Not a fan of Disneyland, no. I think it's almost an insult to our culture here to say, okay, well, let's pretend it's the old days.
Land & Sea will be back in a moment when we'll visit this MacKay-Lyons house in a tiny fishing village. When they built this home, the tax people thought it was a boat shed. Brian MacKay-Lyons grew up by the sea.
My grandfather was a sea captain, had a schooner, Grand Bank schooner. I remember playing in the shavings in the shipyards at Pubnico when I was staying with my grandparents, just being underneath the hulls of ships and playing in the shavings,
He first studied architecture in Halifax, Then it was on to Italy, Japan, and California. He came home in the 1980s. It hasn't been easy.
It's been really hard to build a practice here. And in fact, if it wasn't for the support for the practice that comes from the worldwide community of architects, it would be hard to get up every morning, because there's a lot of discouragement here for creative people. A lot of creative people leave, you know, the Maritimes, always have. If you shoot for the stars, someone will say, well, who does he think he is, you know? Who is he when he's at home? You know, there is a kind of leveling thing that happens in the Maritimes, which is both good and bad. I love it and I hate it, you know.
It looked like Stonehenge initially, this huge concrete form rising out of the ground.
David and Vivian Howard are glad MacKay-Lyons came back to Nova Scotia. When they moved here from Vancouver, they wanted to live on the Atlantic coast. The Howards and their architect agreed their home would be a piece of art on land. The building is narrow, just 12 feet, about 4 meters wide.
Before the house was built, we would come down to the land when it was just, you know, raw land, and we would pace off the dimensions of the house and try and get our head around like how this was going to work.
We thought 12 feet was absurd.
Yeah.
That was just too narrow.
Too narrow.
And we were, and Vivian's father tried to convince us to try and add 2 feet more onto the width, because he was sure that we weren't going to be able to survive in a house that was 12 feet wide. And now, as you experience the space with the 25-foot high ceiling,
there's no notion of it being narrow. There's no narrow feeling in here.
Claustrophobic at all, the opposite, really.
The house fits the place. So much so, it's fooled a few people.
For a number of years, the local assessor took this to be a boat building shed and assessed it as $12,000 building. So the taxes are incredibly light.
we blew it though, because didn't we raise the alert sort of?
Well, we didn't, but the house was on a profile on a program called Homes by Design. And the very next day, we got a phone call from the tax assessor who said,
I want to look at your house.
The word was out.
The word was out, that's right. I need to look at your house again.
So we want to work with the vernacular, and we like the idea that people might, the real folks, might think that this is just a shed that might have been here.
So clearly, in this case, you got it right.
Yeah, I think so.
With this house, the architect has framed the landscape. The building projects over the bay, the village to one side, the sea to the other.
So when you're inside the house, it is helping to educate you into an awareness of the different aesthetics that the house is located in.
As construction costs rose, the Howards made some changes.
So now it's about as stripped down as you can get for a house, with just concrete, steel, and yet it is beautiful. It is an understated, elegant, sophisticated concept that exceeded our dreams when we first began to talk about this with him.
On the balcony of the Howard house, you feel you could be on the bow of an ocean liner. The Mason house, too, is ship-like stem to stern.
And it's kind of autonomous from the land. It sort of floats above the land in a way. And it really orients itself to the views. So you might see it as a kind of camera, if you like, that's about opening up to the views. I learned from a landscape architect actually in California that if you build on top of the hill, it'll always look like you're past the top of the hill, and you don't destroy the hill. You don't use up the hill, if you like, as a piece of landscape. So I think it's more kind, in a way, to the hill to build right on top or right down the bottom. But halfway up the hill destroys the hill.
But that's not the thinking of a lot of architectural tradition, is it? They would say that the hill is nature and ought to be left alone. You build halfway up in order to sort of celebrate the hill.
Well, Frank Lloyd Wright said that,
yeah.
And I think that's the one thing Frank Lloyd Wright was wrong about. You know, the famous American architect. He said you never build on top of the hill. I think it's better to build right on top. And see, I use a lot of the vernacular local building traditions as inspiration. And if you look at these Lunenburg County farms, that's what you see every single time.
This building doesn't give much away to the street.
No, that's intentional. That's a kind of maritime thing, you know, not ostentatious on the street.
Unassuming.
Yep, it's a Celtic thing, you know.
So we're actually entering by what would be the stern of the boat here.
Yeah, so the courtyard is the kind of reward, in a way, for going through that narrow entrance that we went through. And we're in midship now, you know, with the gunnels here. Guests in the stern, main house in the bow, and then there's a kind of bow balcony as well, you know, like on the front of a sailboat.
Most ships don't have a pool amidships.
No, except the Queen Mary or something. Yeah, well, this is the great room. It's a double height space, therefore, and it's really focuses on this big bridge that shoots across with the steel construction, and it literally flies across the space, and it has a big skylight above it, and creates a cozy place for the kitchen below it. So now when you're in this space, you get a totally different thing. When you drop your eyes down, you get the big horizontal effect out along the coastline. So even though the house, Jim, is looking out to sea, the views are really across the house. So there's a 24-foot sheet of glass on this side and a 24-foot sheet of glass on this side. You know, nature's way more interesting than anything we can make. And so really the job of the architecture is stand back and let us enjoy that. And it always changes, right?
Tell me about this kitchen.
I think for a house to feel like home, it needs a focal element. And the kitchen really is that. It's the kind of focal thing. It's the thing at the center that makes it home, you know?
And the maritime party always ends up in the kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
So you put the kitchen where the party ought to be.
Yep.
So from the kitchen, it's off into the pantry?
Yeah, pantry or galley if you're thinking about a boat.
It is ship-like in here, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's also a traditional country thing, maritime thing, to have a separate pantry. And I think it's still very practical. You know, we do modern buildings, but we use very traditional ideas.
So this is the balcony on the bow. You
Prow of the ship, yep.
Yeah.
And there you get the good view of the fields, you know, the pastoral landscape
Yes.
across there.
Yes. And from the other side, out to sea.
Out to sea, along the islands, along the edge of Mahone Bay, really.
Right.
So I find this more interesting than that, which everybody thinks is the interesting thing. You know, there's just a straight out to the ocean thing.
Uh-huh.
But I find the sort of spatial effects, you know, in between the islands and the shoreline a lot more interesting.
For MacKay-Lyons, it's all about the ever-changing sea and the weathered buildings of Nova Scotia's coastal villages. All about barn and boat.
I think those are the primary kind of cultural references here in the Maritimes, and that's what I use for my inspiration. Now, that might confuse people because the buildings may not literally look like that. But a building is not a boat. You know, it doesn't need to look like a boat to feel that way.
Land and Sea returns in a moment as the tractor-driving architect shows us his lab on the Lunenburg shore. Just up the hill from his own home in Upper Kingsburg, Lunenburg County, Brian MacKay-Lyons is building a house for a friend.
So we bought this property to stop a developer from buying it, and then sold it to somebody who would do the right thing. So the right thing to me is to build a thin house up against the north boundary of the site, leaving the land for the foreseeable future still pasture land. This has got a straight interior, and the whole rest of the house outside is just, looks like it's sliding down the hill. Straight across the lake,
Right.
right across the lake to that high hill over there. And then all of this glass
Is on the ocean.
is on the ocean. So all the way along the horizon is just continuous right across. So south, in this case, is the ocean horizon.
Now, as to cost, a MacKay-Lyons house may be had for $200,000, but some are in the $1 million range. At the ocean's edge on MacKay-Lyons land in Upper Kingsburg is the architect's pet project. He teaches at Dalhousie University, but he's found a way to take architecture out of the classroom.
I started doing it because it was a critique of what I saw happening in architectural education on one hand and in architectural practice on the other hand. Practice used to be a continuation of education. Practitioners used to really provide apprenticeship. And I think practices have become mercenary and don't do that well anymore. Schools have become esoteric and have lost, in many ways, their connection with things physical.
So each summer, he welcomes students, architects, and teachers from many countries to gather here to design and build. It's an exercise. Their buildings temporary.
And then it's gone again. So it's like the burning ship on the horizon.
Gone, but not before a big party, a celebration on a summer night. Some of the buildings here are permanent. They are cottages where the summer visitors stay. They could be fish sheds on a maritime wharf. When Brian MacKay-Lyons was in school, his professors tried to convince the young architect that borrowing from the vernacular, barn and boat and all that, wasn't real architecture.
Didn't stop me.
His buildings are a meld of the modern and the maritime. They've won him international acclaim. But even if his barn and boat buildings go global, and they may, Brian MacKay-Lyons will always be of this place. Next on Land and Sea. 15 years ago, 5 little girls from Fogo Island, Newfoundland came together over the button accordion. They're all young women now, but they're still pushing all the right buttons. Watch for a few tunes between friends. Next time on Land and Sea.